I know that when I started getting into stationery, one of my biggest questions was, do I need expensive brush markers or will cheap markers do the trick? And I'm going to attempt to answer that question in this video. Basically, I'm going to be testing out a bunch of cheaper brush markers and comparing them to the Tombow dual brush pens, which are definitely more expensive, and see how they perform. I'm going to be showing you a set of dollar store brush markers. Yes, I was very surprised that they come in that price range. A set of cheaper metallic brush markers. And a 24 color set of what I thought were very promising brush markers from American Crafts, which is in fact what we're going to start with. So let's jump right in. So I bought this set on sale for $10. Originally it was priced at $15.99, which is actually pretty good considering that there are 24 colors here, and the Tombow dual brush pens, you get 10 colors for around $30. So I was really excited about these. And right off the bat, I can tell you that the tips are definitely much smaller for these markers. That's generally not an issue unless you like a bigger marker, but there are definitely many other issues that I discovered when I started trying them out. Honestly, these felt very strange. They didn't even feel like brush markers, they felt like regular hard markers with a somewhat flexible tip that then refused to bounce back after you actually started writing with them. So as a result, you can only get a thin line at the beginning, and after that you can't really vary your lines very much. A lot of these markers actually had their tips permanently bent out of shape just from the tiny amount of writing I was doing for this video. Just for comparison, I've had my Tombow dual brush pen for quite a few months already, and it's barely showing anywhere. And the last thing, which was actually kind of a shock for me, is that you might notice that I'm skipping some colors, and that's because I could not open these markers. They were really hard to open. So I had to stop while I was filming this and go get my significant other to help me open these markers. And some of them he couldn't even open, so he actually had to use pliers, and I am not joking, to open some of these markers. I have never had such a horrible marker experience in my life. Now, comparing them to the Tombow dual brush pen on the same page, I can tell you that the Tombow dual brush pen is so much easier to use and produces much better lines. Now, having said all of that, there are definitely some pros to these markers. The first being that they're pretty cheap when it comes to brush pens. The second being that you get quite a few colors, again, because they're so much cheaper than the Tombow dual brush pens. And the third being that they actually are pretty good in terms of bleeding or ghosting, even on somewhat thinner paper, which I'm showing you here. Actually see that they ghost just a little bit more than the Tombows do. So technically they're not bad markers, except for the fact that you wouldn't be able to open some of them, but I still wouldn't recommend them. Moving on from this rather disappointing first experience, we are going to try out these metallic brush tip markers. Now, right away I can tell you that the brush tips here are much smaller than the Tombow dual brush pens, which for me is not a bad thing, but again, it's all a matter of preference. This set I got for around $10, and you get 10 colors in the set, one of which is white. And the colors themselves are beautiful. I mean, I actually genuinely love how these look. As for the brush tips themselves, they feel a little weird. They're very flexible to the point where they almost don't feel like brush tips, but more like they only have flexibility at the very base of the marker. So as soon as you press down with any amount of pressure, it just presses down all the way. But that does allow you to produce quite a nice variation between your thinner and thicker strokes, which is actually pretty good for beginners, which I definitely am when it comes to brush markers and brush lettering. So while the quality of the brush tip itself is definitely not as good as the Tombow dual brush pen, I think that they're actually pretty good, and I actually might like them more. Also, since these are metallic, we definitely have to try them over black. So let's do that now. And as you can see, they look amazing. The colors show up very well, they're quite vivid, very saturated, and I love how they have this sort of subtle variation in their colors. if you can tell what I mean on camera, but some areas sort of look more metallic than others, which gives them a sort of slightly ombre effect, which I think is really, really cool. Now, the white could be a little bit more saturated over black, but I'm okay with it. It does take a little while for the white to fully appear on the black, and I've seen that before. I actually have another set of metallic markers where the white had the exact same, I don't know if you want to call it a problem. It makes it a little bit more difficult to write just because you can't really tell what you're writing as you're writing, but it's not really a big issue. And of course the rest of the colors actually appear right away, so that's not an issue for the other colors at all. Also, I love that these practically don't ghost and almost don't show up at all on the other side of the page. This is actually very close to the Tombow dual brush pen, which I'm about to show you right now. So as you can see, just like the Tombow dual brush pen, you can barely see these metallic markers on the other side of the page. So far I think we've had a more of a hit and miss situation, so now let's move on to the dollar store brush markers. Shockingly, even though they are by far the cheapest markers in this video, they actually have two tips as well. So one is a fine liner and one is a brush pen. So just looking at the brush tips themselves, they're definitely the closest in size to the Tombow dual brush pens. And you can see that the tip on the right, which is the dollar store brush pen, is already a little bit bent, and I've only used that brush pen a little bit before this video. So it's not great, but it's also not horribly bent like the markers that I showed you in the very beginning of this video. This set actually cost $4, and there are 12 colors in this set, so that's actually a pretty good variety of color. Now, as for how the brush tips actually behave on the page, honestly, they're definitely much worse than the Tombows. Now, they're not horrible and they do have some flexibility, but it does feel like the top half of the marker is just so much more flexible than the other half of the marker. So once you start writing, it just doesn't spring back and it's so much harder to get a thin line, and therefore it's just so much harder to get a variation between your thicker and thinner strokes. And another thing that I found for this particular set is that the quality between markers was very inconsistent. Now, the first set was just consistently bad throughout, but for this set, some of them were definitely better than others, and some of them were actually somewhat close to the Tombow dual brush pens, but some of them were much closer to the markers in the first set, which was pretty bad. Overall though, I don't think that it's a horrible set to get, especially if you want to practice with brush markers, especially considering the fact that this set is just so very affordable. And comparing them to the Tombow dual brush pens, some of them actually perform fairly decently. Also, in terms of bleeding and ghosting on the other side of the page, you can see that they're actually pretty good with that as well. Again, they do show up on the other side of the page more than the Tombow dual brush pens, but not by much actually. So, having gone through all of this, to answer the question of, do you need expensive brush pens? I think that really depends on what you're going to be using them for. First of all, definitely read some reviews if you're going to be purchasing any brush pens online. And second, maybe check out your dollar store if you're a complete beginner and you want some brush pens to just practice with. On the other hand, if you know yourself and you know that you will get discouraged by bad quality materials right off the bat, then please do yourself a favor and get a Tombow dual brush pen. You can actually only get one in one color and practice with that until you get the hang of it. Personally, I would recommend black just because that's my favorite neutral color to use, and that is what I got, and I'm not regretting it at all. And of course, if you want something more unique, you can definitely go for the set of metallic brush pens, which definitely do behave differently from the Tombow dual brush pens, but I wouldn't say that they behave differently in a bad way, and they look really pretty. So definitely consider those as well. And that was it. I really hope that you found this video useful. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in my next one. Bye!